I'm Nate Eaton, and this is True Crime Rocket Science.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The first point scored by the prosecution was basically showing the jury the sights and the sounds of the crime. They played a grueling 911 call as well as showed body cam footage of the first officers arriving on the scene to find Mo lying in a bloodbath on the bathroom floor. She had apparently been shot through the heart by someone who'd stood over her. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I will be continuing coverage of the Mo Wilson trial. I'm also going to be in Austin for some of it. So if you're interested in this particular case, you might want to subscribe to this channel. By the way, I'm not going to be putting up a lot of images. It's going to basically be done as in a kind of a podcast format. If that's good enough for you, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. So the prosecutor, Ricky Jones, told the jurors that the last thing Mo did on this earth was scream in terror. And apparently they played some of this audio where you hear the faint sounds of Mo screaming and kind of a popping sound, and then the screaming stops. Right? And so this suggests that Ring doorbell cameras somewhere in the area picked up Mo screaming. But one imagines, it wasn't hard, given this footage, to sympathize with the victim. And apparently many in the court appeared emotional when the distressing 911 call was played. I know when I read about it on Twitter, it was hard not to be touched by that. Now, according to an article in CBS Austin, I'll put a link to that in the description, quote, the state then pulled out the 911 call cache placed at 9:54 p.m., a few minutes after arriving home. The audio contained a frantic Cash heaving with breath and crying. The dispatcher instructed Cash on how to perform CPR as she waited on police and emergency medical services, EMS. The dispatcher is trying to keep Cash calm, saying she's performing the chest compressions at a perfect pace. Cash performed dozens of compressions. People in the room were noticeably emotional as the 911 call played out. And I think what that 911 call did was it really brought home the reality of this. That it's not just another case, that this really happened. Someone really did die. And this must be a very difficult thing to do. You arrive home and you sort of flung into these circumstances that somebody else has created. And now you're performing CPS on someone who is probably deceased, but, you sort of feel one has to do it just in case there's a chance, just in case there's a spark of life. And so at one point, the dispatcher tells Cash, don't give up, right? But she's crying as she counts out loud. The dispatcher is encouraging her along the way. Cash says she can hear the sirens in the distance. Now, one of the first points scored by the defense was a concession made by the first witness on the stand, Mo Wilson's brother, Matthew. And Matthew said, Mo wasn't in love with Strickland when she was murdered. And let's assume that that is true. Let's accept that Matthew's right about that. It may seem like a major point, but I think the larger question is, what did Caitlin Armstrong think? And I don't think it's so much whether Mo was in love with Strickland, but the other way around. If Strickland still had feelings for Mo, even that isn't really the relevant question here. The relevant question is whether Caitlin was jealous. And you can have a situation where Mo wasn't in love with Strickland and Strickland wasn't in love with Mo, but what matters here is how Caitlin feels about the two spending time together. And what does that say? What does that say when he's spending time with her and she's come to Austin and they live together? How does that make her feel? Bear in mind, in a weird way, Caitlin Armstrong Colin Strickland and Mo Wilson are in the same sort of category as elite cyclists. So in a weird way, they're two peas in the pod, that they are kind of destined in a way to come together in a way that excludes her. And what I mean is they get on their bikes and they participate in events and they're part of the sort of elite of the elites, right? The VIPs. And Caitlin isn't. And so they sort of find themselves in the same rarefied air, just as a matter of, in terms of their work, in terms of their sport. And Caitlin's excluded from that. How do you think she feels about that? I also think it's the nature of on-off relationships. Have you ever been in one? That it tends to increase the intensity of jealousy far beyond what would be the case in a relationship that simply ends and that's it. The on-off relationship primes the people in it for the next phase and the next phase. And the next phase is always worse. Now, according to CBS Austin, you'll hear from Colin that the relationship was on-off, on-again, off-again. And you will hear that when the relationship was off, they both dated other people. Jones says that Armstrong began looking up photos and information on Wilson. That's another way that you can get a real artificial sense of jealousy, in a sense, which wasn't so true a long time ago, right? Now you can see someone and get a sense of how someone you know might also see them and to what extent they're a threat, right? Based on how their fairy tale is going and how much they're living life and just how vivid their story is starting to appear in social media. One of the ways that Armstrong looked up photos of Mo Wilson was on the cycling app Strava. It's actually not just a cycling app. It's also running, stand-up paddling, hiking, etc. But cyclists, very popular with cyclists. Jones claimed that the evidence will show Armstrong looking Wilson up multiple times on that app, according to CBS Austin. Now, interestingly, although CBS's reporting mentions Strava, it misses the crucial detail, and that is how many times did Caitlin Armstrong look it up and exactly when. And I do think it's quite amazing how much digital traces are left behind, the detail of it these days, and how useful these breadcrumbs are becoming in criminal trial. And not just the social media traces and the browser history, but also increasingly things like Ring doorbell digital evidence. So according to Alex Caprariello, on May 10th, Armstrong looked up Wilson 4 times on Strava. That's on the day that she died. I beg your pardon, that's on the day before she died. Meanwhile, Caitlin's defense tried to perform a magic trick in their opening statements, and I remember them saying words to this effect prior to this. Jeffrey Puryear, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, he said, "You did not hear any direct evidence that Caitlin Armstrong is responsible for this crime, because there isn't any." And I think what they're playing on is the assumption that you can't convict someone on circumstantial evidence, right? And that's just a myth. It's just a myth. He goes on to say, ballistic science isn't a science at all and is not highly regarded by the general scientific community. I would also tend to disagree with that there is a scientific aspect to it. And it is it's not an exact science, but it's certainly something that shows certain kinds of patterns. I wouldn't say it's completely nonsensical. Anyway, several Austin Police Department officers were also called up to testify on the first day. Several videos of body-worn camera footage were shared in court. Officer Salinas' body cam showed him taking over compressions on Wilson while Cash and the officers waited for the EMS. It was during his testimony that Salinas said he saw a bullet casing next to his foot in the blood while giving chest compressions. Cash can be heard making a similar remark on the body cam footage. Another officer described the scene and the search for Wilson's bike, which Cash said was missing from the living room. Now, I've seen some remarks somewhere that the prosecution seem to believe they have Caitlin Armstrong's DNA on the bicycle found stashed or staged around the corner. There might be a problem with that DNA. It might not be a complete sample. It might be, how can I put it? It might be a probable sample, put it that way. But I do think the prosecution are going to try and make the case that this could be Caitlin Armstrong's DNA. We'll see how that stands up in court. Poirier, the defense attorney, according to CBS Austin, asked several questions about whether the officers were wearing gloves and how the crime scene was maintained. The officers all stated that they were wearing gloves. And I do think the main thrust of the defense case is going to be to try and undermine the investigators and the investigations, to say that this detective's got very little experience and this and that and the next thing. And so I think the strength of the prosecution's case is really going to go into the dynamics of the relationship, to what extent that they can kind of construct this love triangle, if that's what it was. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.